All right, so here's an example of just understanding if this is true or false. So we're looking at a conditional and reading it and talking about it. So if you subtract a whole number from another whole number, the result is also a whole number. So what do you think? If you subtract a whole number from another whole number, what is our result? So we have to look at this and determine, is this true or false? And if we go through the process, that the conclusion is false, because if you would take a whole number 2 minus a whole number 7, we don't necessarily get a whole number because it's negative. So in this case, we would say this example is false. The last month was February, then this month is March. If the last month was February, would the next month be March? Well, we go through the months, February, March, April, so we should be able to say that this is a true statement, right? So in this case, when they didn't write it as an if-then statement, the first thing that you would want to do is take your time and rewrite the problem in if-then form. So again, I would take the sentence that they gave me. When a rectangle has an obtuse angle, it is a parallelogram. And I would make that into an if-then statement first. So the first thing I would write is, if a rectangle has an obtuse angle, then it is a parallelogram. Now here you might run into problems if you don't know really what a parallelogram is. We'll talk a long time about this later on in the book, but that's the first thing that I have to think about. So what's a parallelogram? You'd have to know that it's a shape that has some kind of opposite sides being parallel and congruent to each other. So if we draw a real quick one here, and they're saying a rectangle with a, this should be a straighter line than that, sorry. Something like this. Okay, so when a rectangle has an obtuse angle, is this considered a parallelogram? And so what do you think? If we go through there, the hypothesis is false, since a rectangle can never have an obtuse angle. So my conditional would be false. But when they say this at the beginning, this is that one that we said was a little weird, because the hypothesis is false, and as soon as that is false, we know that it's automatically true. And again, that's one of those weird ones. Okay? So that's one part of it. And then if we continue on, this is one of the problems where we would look at all four of the things. So it says write the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive of the follow, and then determine the truth value of each statement. If it is false, give a counterexample. So the first thing that I'm going to do is take my original sentence, bats are animals that can fly, and write it in if-then form. And if I do that, I get, if an animal is a bat, then it can fly. So then I have to stop and I have to ask myself, is this true or false? If an animal is a bat, can it fly? And we would say, sure, this is true. So from there, then you have to go through and you have to write the other three forms. So the next one would be the converse. What did we say was the converse? Well, the converse we said was to take the original hypothesis and the original conclusion and flip them. So I'm going to rewrite it, writing my conclusion first, and then writing my hypothesis second. So what is my new statement? My new statement for the converse would be, if an animal can fly, then it is a bat, as we can show right here. So again, notice that we did include another word here on the second part. We just put the word animal in there, and that's okay. But now we ask the question to ourselves, if an animal can fly, is it automatically a bat? Well, this would be false, because we know what else can fly. Well, we know that birds can fly. So my counterexample is a bird. So it's false because birds can also fly. From there, then, we talk about inverses, right? Now, in an inverse, remember, you want to automatically go back to your original statement. So my original statement was, if an animal is a bat, then it can fly. I'm going to use that conditional, but I'm going to do the inverse to it now. So what does that mean? That means I'm going to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion. And the easiest way for me to negate both of those is simply put in not. So when we go to this, if an animal is not a bat, then it cannot fly. So we inserted not in both the hypothesis and the conclusion. But remember, the biggest part of this is to go back to the original conditional. Okay, so then after you've gotten it written, again, the writing of it should be pretty simple. You're just following the rules. But now you got to stop and you got to think again. If an animal is not a bat, then it cannot fly. So you just got to stop and think. If an animal is not a bat, think about another animal. Then can it not fly? Well, here again, a bird is not a bat, but it can still fly. So again, my inverse would be false. Because again, my counterexample would be any kind of a bird. Well, sorry, most birds. All right? And then the last one is my contrapositive. So again, when we do my contrapositive, we're going back to our original conditional, and now we're going to flip-flop our hypothesis and conclusion, and we're going to negate both of them. So we basically do the old switcheroo, and we turn them into negatives. So my contrapositive, they didn't show it to me. So my contrapositive is, if an animal cannot fly, then it is not a bat. So if an animal cannot fly, think about an animal that cannot fly, then it is not a bat. What do you think? The contrapositive is true, okay? And so then, again, remember, were the statements, the beginning and the end, our original conditional and the contrapositive, both the same truth value? Yeah, they're both true. Were the two middle ones, my converse and inverse, both the same? Yeah, they were both false. So both the traditional and our conditional and contrapositive were true. The converse and inverse were false. So it sounds like we did it right. So we go through another one here. Again, it says write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the statement. The sum of the measures of two complementary angles is 90 degrees. So again, the first thing that I would do is take the time to write my conditional. So my conditional for this one would be if the sum of the measures of two complementary, or if I have the sum of the two complementary angles, then their measures are 90 degrees. And if I take the sum of the measures of two complementary angles, yeah, by definition, they would be 90 degrees. So that my original conditional is true. Then we go to the converse, so we're going to flip-flop them, right? The hypothesis and conclusion. So if two angles have a measure of 90 degrees, then they are complementary angles. And again, that would be true, right? If I add two things up to 90 degrees, I automatically can call them complementary. My third one would be the inverse. So now I'm taking and going back to my original order and then just making them negative. So I would say, if the sum of the measure or the sum of two angles is not complementary, then their measures are not 90 degrees. And again, this would be true just by what I'm writing. And again, I realize that we're kind of going through this by not actually writing it down, but when you take the time to write this down, you would see that that's exactly what you would have and that it would be true. And then the last one is the contrapositive. So again, what do you do in the contrapositive? In the contrapositive, you take your original conditional, you flip-flop your hypothesis and conclusion, and you turn them into negative. So now we would start out with this part. If two angles are not 90 degrees, then the sum of their measures are not complementary angles, or they are not called complementary angles. And again, that one is true. So this word sum kind of gets mixed up in the process. Sometimes you might have to turn it or move it over to the other part, but if you look at on your paper, it would be easier to look at. So I believe all these were true, and again, if you went with the beginning and knew that your first one is true, you know that your contrapositive is going to be true. And if you did your converse and knew that that was true, then you could also have a true statement for your inverse. So, again, if you have any questions, we will talk about this a little bit more. But here is your assignment. And also, notice up here that we will have a quiz on Thursday.